Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma, and today I want to talk a little bit about anxiety and stress, because the world feels like it's awash with anxiety at the moment. Now, I used to have a dog. He was a rescue dog, and he was sweet and affectionate, but certain things made him nervous, particularly sudden loud noises, which could be a real problem. And we lived quite near a park, and every year, round about the beginning of November, used to be a lot of noise from fireworks. And if somebody let off a firecracker while we were out walking, he'd try and run away. And on bonfire night, he would hide under the table and he would tremble. And there wasn't much we could do to help him. We weren't able to tell him it's okay, it's just noise, it'll pass. And the best that we could do was just sit with him. And of course, his anxiety was completely natural, it was completely understandable, it was simply based on a survival mechanism. And it wasn't his fault that the world was sometimes terrifying. And I think it's like that, but maybe more complicated for us humans. We're like dogs, we've been evolved to react to threat and danger. We're born sensitive. But we're possibly more prone to hang on to our anxiety. Anxiety can sit and it can hum in the background for us. And it can make us feel ashamed. It can really colour our relationship with others. It can really affect how we perceive the world. And sometimes it can completely take the joy out of life. So agitation is something that could be present in all sorts of ways. It can be present in the smallest of ways. Sometimes it's just an undercurrent. And our lives don't have to be threatened for us to feel anxious or agitated. We worry about everything. We worry about discomfort. We worry about making a bad impression on other people. We worry about missing out on something. We worry that all the sunbeds are going to be taken. And we spend an awful lot of time feeding negative mind states. We spend an awful lot of time fueling our anxiety. And we create enemies of people where they just don't exist. And we're constantly trying to fix things and adjust things and get rid of things. And then we blame ourselves for not being happier. But actually with humans, just as much as with dogs, it's just natural. It's just what we do. It's how we evolved. Many of our most unhelpful patterns are survival patterns. And they're based on the need for safety. But those patterns are not required anymore. Sometimes we have overactive survival mechanisms. So before I start to talk about how we engage with our anxiety, I just want to try and dispel any sense that it's about us being faulty or bad or stupid. It just is. It's just evolution. And shame binds us to those feelings of anxiety and agitation. And it makes them stick around much longer. And there's actually no need for shame. There's no need to add any kind of extra layer of self-reproach. So the starting place for me, when I first started to work with anxiety, was always a sense of possibility, that things can be different. The idea that we can just wake up sometime from this fever dream. And I'm not talking about blind faith here. It was something I could experience directly, even just for a moment or two. So when I first really started engaging with meditation practice and with Buddhist teachings, one of the things that I found transformational was this teaching that all things just arise from conditions. Everything is just conditioned by everything else. We're not a type, there's no life sentence, it's just habits of mind. And those habits of mind can be changed. It all depends very much on what's being fed, what's being reinforced. So just as you can learn to drive and you can learn to play the piano and so on, actually engaging with stress and agitation is a skill that improves with practice. We don't have to be perfect, and we don't actually have to get it right every time. So we practice with whatever we can practice with in any particular moment. If we can love our experience in this moment and embrace it fully, that's beautiful. If the best that we can do is to tolerate it, that's absolutely fine too. But if we're reacting and we can't help reacting, which sometimes happens, but at least we know that we're reacting, we're still engaging with it on some level. Now, one of the things for me that I've struggled with over the years is patience. Or maybe that should be impatience, because impatience can often come bundled up with anxiety. And when we're feeling impatient, it triggers craving and agitation. And it's a form of dissociation. It's a way of leaning forward into the next moment. And sometimes being impatient was helpful for me. It helped me in the realm of work when I was running a company. Things got done. But a lot of the time it wasn't needed. A lot of the time it created tension and unhappiness. And it still arises sometimes, this idea that the world is in my way. And we're often in situations where there's uncertainty. We don't know how they're going to end up. And what we want is certainty. We want to know that things are going to go our way. And this practice has taught me that patience is a skill. Patience is something we can train ourselves in. Partly by just observing our impatience and noticing how that feels. So I'm not talking about practicing resignation or endurance, but rather patience. It's a patient engagement. And this is something Shantideva talked about patience. He said, "Do not get angry with those who harm you, but if you do, then however much anger you feel, cultivate patience too." This is called transcendence. However much anger you do feel, cultivate that much patience. So patience and forbearance are not actually means to an end. It's no good saying I'm going to be patient until I get what I want. This is about patience actually as a way of living, a way of being in the world, as an alternative to our tendency to lean forwards into a better moment. And it requires a lot of trust and confidence to stay in the present, because we tend to want a better moment. We want a better self, not this irritated, fearful self. And we look to the next moment to provide that. So cultivating patience includes patience towards yourself. Patience towards yourself is an important part of kindness. So there's a great deal of forgiveness in this. And it moves us away from the activities of anxiety and irritation towards being able to operate in the midst of everything. So it's a movement towards a sense of confidence and capability. And patience is also one of the foundations of equanimity, of balance, the ability to be with whatever is going on. And the goal of this practice, the reward for all that work, all that meditation, is equanimity. Steadiness in the midst of whatever is going on around us. And that steadiness, that stillness, it doesn't mean the absence of activity. It's the absence of reactivity. So in the language of Buddhist teachings, it's the absence of craving and aversion. And this stillness is always available to us, no matter what. And we practice by developing the habits of awareness and mindfulness and learning to calm ourselves by bringing the attention to the breath in the body when we're having a small meltdown. And that way, when the bigger stresses arise, we've got a skill, we've got a strategy that we can employ. We practice by reminding ourselves that not all of our thoughts are true. With stillness, we can start to move away from that sense of this is true, or this is how things are, to a much more flexible, open stance. And we practice by developing our capacity for kindness and friendliness and connection. Metta is the word in Pali. And if we find ourselves perceiving someone as an enemy, or a rival, or an obstacle, we can practice just by saying to ourselves, there goes someone just like me. Because when we practice this form of friendliness, this metta, our perception changes. We actually find ways to be more generous and more forgiving, more compassionate, more patient. And we sever the emotional history from the perception. And this is important. We're actually severing the link between whatever baggage we're taking with us and the actual perception. And that changes the shape of our mind, and it changes the shape of our world. It changes our whole experience of the world. It liberates our creativity and our wholeheartedness. It helps us with mindfulness, with joy. So the Buddha taught kindness and compassion actually as antidotes to fear and aversion and irritation. Because the world actually presents us with so many opportunities for hostility, for fear, so many triggers, so many reasons to contract and withdraw and take ourselves away from the world. It can take a real effort to respond with friendliness and compassion. But the more we do, the more it becomes naturalized and the easier it becomes. And there's so much value in learning to calm ourselves, in actually practicing regulating our feelings and emotions. You don't have to go away on retreat to do this. You can just do it anywhere. You just have to remember sometimes. To remember to stop, to breathe, to connect, to forgive. To practice patience, to make a conscious choice in relation to your attention. And I can't emphasize enough the value of just a moment of stillness, a moment of just mindful breathing. Even if it's just a taste of stillness in the midst of all the agitation and the anxiety and the drama. Just coming back to the breath is an act of kindness towards yourself. The more we do that, the easier it becomes. And sometimes I practice diaphragm breathing. It's really belly breathing, breathing right down into the belly, just using my lungs to their full capacity. And it can really help us to relax doing this, just lowering the heart rate. Another technique you might have come across is 4-7-8 breathing. So you breathe in for a count of 4, and then you hold it for a count of 7, and then you breathe out for a count of 8. So if we're experiencing a stress response, this can bring about a relaxation response. And that relaxation response creates the whole ground on which we can then meet whatever's coming towards us, whatever anxiety or agitation is happening. We can meet it with some friendliness. And it helps us to release the grip of fear or irritation or anger. And we're no longer building our identity around it. And as soon as we recognize the narrative, we're no longer being caught up in it. And instead we're just holding it in friendliness, holding it in mindfulness. And that can be described as gently turning towards something. It's the willingness to stay with something. Because the world can be terrifying, it can be threatening, it can be infuriating, sickening. There's all sorts of examples of the world just being grossly unfair. And yet, we still have to find a way to live here. We still have to find a way to live joyfully, with steadiness, with resilience, with adaptability. Now, you might have read a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. This was written in the 1940s, just after he'd been held in a Nazi concentration camp. And he writes about how the inmates were influenced by their surroundings, and about how for most people, quite understandably, anything not connected with the task of staying alive just lost its value. But he also writes about how some people would walk through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. And he writes, they may have been few in numbers, but they were living proof that anything can be taken away from you except one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude, to choose one's way. So if the world isn't looking after us, it can make us angry and depressed. It can make us anxious and fearful. Understandably, it can make us want to just go into ourselves, to go behind our defenses. But if we can respond skillfully to those feelings of anxiety or depression or anger, we get to choose our attitude. We can choose our way through the world, whatever's going on around us. We can hold steady, and we can remember what's important. So that's this week's episode of Kitchen Sink Dharma. Thank you as always for listening. Please join me next time.